Before names like America, Canada, or even Indigenous or First Nations were spoken, this land had its own names, its own stories, and its own people. The true owners of the land. They were not discovered, they did not immigrate, they were always here. But history as we know it began with the lie of discovery. This episode begins with the truth. The land was never empty, the myth of discovery. When European colonizers set foot on these lands, they claimed it under the doctrine of terra nullius, Latin for nobody's land. But it was not empty. It was home to millions. Estimates say over 60 million indigenous people lived across the Americas before contact. In what is now the U.S. and Canada, over 500 distinct nations thrived. From the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains, from the Arctic tundra to the Pacific coast, every inch of this land was known, named, and nurtured. These were not wandering nomads, they were settled people. Some lived in permanent towns with agricultural economies. Others were mobile societies deeply in tune with the land's rhythms. Take the Mississippian civilization, for example. Around 1050 CE, their capital city, Cahokia, near present-day Illinois, had a population of nearly 20,000, larger than London at the time. They built massive earthen mounds, conducted complex trade, and had advanced astronomy aligned with solstices and equinoxes. In the northeast, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often called the Iroquois, formed a powerful alliance of nations, governed by a constitution known as the Great Law of Peace, which would go on to inspire aspects of the U.S. Constitution itself. The myth that North America was a virgin wilderness was not ignorance, it was strategy. It justified theft. They didn't discover the land. They renamed it, and in doing so, they tried to erase those who already lived here. Civilizations of knowledge, science, diplomacy, and systems. Indigenous nations across North America had advanced knowledge systems, built not in ivory towers, but rooted in observation, oral tradition, and sacred relationships with the land. The Anishinaabe mapped the stars with oral stories and navigated vast water routes across the Great Lakes using birch bark canoes. The Blackfoot Confederacy managed bison populations through sustainable hunting and practiced intricate ceremonial governance through their Sundance and Bundle societies. The Diné, Navajo, developed a complex code of clan-based governance. The Cherokee had their own written language developed by Sequoyah in the early 1800s, an achievement matched by few other civilizations under colonial pressure. Across the continent, there were education systems, laws, conflict resolution practices, and intertribal diplomacy long before Europeans arrived. These systems were oral, not written, and because they weren't European, they were dismissed as uncivilized. But let's be clear, oral traditions are not inferior. They are resilient. They preserved languages, histories, and science for thousands of years, even under brutal attempts to silence them. The Hopi followed lunar cycles for agriculture and ceremonies. The Cree Indian passed survival knowledge across generations, knowledge that allowed explorers to survive northern winters. These societies may not have had printing presses, but they had wisdom carved into stories, ceremonies, and sky maps that colonial powers could never fully understand. Sacred relationships, land, spirit, and the circle of life. Unlike colonial empires, indigenous nations didn't see land as a resource to be owned, exploited, or sold. The land was a living relative, not property. Mountains were grandparents, rivers were lifeblood, animals were teachers. For the Lakota, the philosophy of Mikoye Oyasin, all my relations, meant everything was interconnected. The Ojibwe followed the 7 grandfather teachings, a code of life rooted in humility, love, wisdom, bravery, truth, respect, and honesty. These weren't just moral values, they were cultural frameworks embedded in daily life. Ceremonies weren't just rituals. They were protocols of respect between humans, spirits, ancestors, and the earth. The potlatch ceremony of the Pacific Northwest wasn't just a feast, it was a legal and economic system of redistribution and status. This spiritual and ecological harmony wasn't romantic nostalgia, it was sustainability in action. Colonizers viewed the land as empty, undeveloped, and underutilized, but indigenous people saw it as a system of sacred exchange. Where Europeans saw untapped resources, indigenous people saw balance, a balance violently broken when capitalism arrived with flags and muskets. The erasure begins how history was rewritten. The biggest weapon of colonization was not just gunpowder, it was the pen. Textbooks and treaties were written not just to control land, but to control the story. Colonizers didn't just conquer territory, they conquered narratives. Entire civilizations were renamed, misrepresented, or outright erased. Maps erased indigenous place names. Stories were altered to portray native people as savages, drunks, or relics of the past. Hollywood turned proud warriors into side characters. School curriculums skipped thousands of years of civilization to begin with Columbus or the Pilgrims. Even today, many students graduate without knowing the names of the nations whose land their schools are built on. It wasn't accidental. It was systemic historical amnesia. By making native peoples invisible, it became easier to justify everything else: land theft, broken treaties, forced assimilation, and residential schools. But indigenous voices never went silent. They were silenced. Today, those voices are rising again, resisting, reclaiming, remembering. They were not victims, they are survivors. This story is not about a vanished people. It's about a living, breathing resistance. Despite genocide, displacement, and decades of assimilation policies, indigenous nations are still here. From the Wet'suwet'en defending their land in Canada to the Standing Rock Sioux resisting pipelines in the U.S., indigenous peoples continue to protect the earth, not just for themselves, but for everyone. Languages are being revived, ceremonies restored, treaties re-examined. The truth is coming out, and it's not just a chapter of history, it's the foundation. They were never just victims. They were astronomers, farmers, engineers, artists, philosophers, and warriors. And they still are. In telling this story, their story, we're not giving them a voice. We're finally listening to it. In the next episode, we uncover the violent shift from contact to conquest, how disease, war, and deception reshaped the continent, and how indigenous nations fought back. Episode 2. The invasion begins, contact, conquest, and the first resistance. The erasure of indigenous history wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate. And the only way to undo that is by telling the real story, loudly, truthfully, and unapologetically. Subscribe for the next episode where we expose how the so-called discovery of America was actually the beginning of an invasion, and how indigenous resistance began from day one. Because they were always here, and they are still here.